boy named Michel leaves home and rides his bike to a costume shop where he hopes to buy a Spider-Man costume for Halloween. After admiring the costume for a while, he knocks on the door so that the owner can let him in, but the man says he's not open yet. Michel doesn't get this, and he keeps trying to get the man to open the door, but he insists that the shop is still closed. Michel eventually walks away from there, but as someone bumps into him, he nearly loses his money. After he saves it from flying away, Michel enters his bike and heads to school. When he gets there, he parks his bike and hides his money inside his shoe before heading inside. While he's in class, Michel secretly records a video of his crush, Stella, but he eventually stops just as someone sees him. As his teacher also sees him with his phone, she seizes it and asks if he wants to repeat 9th grade like a bully named Ivan.
Vuoi rifare la terza come Casadio?
Michel doesn't say anything, but Ivan finds it funny and makes a joke with his friend, Brando. Almost immediately, the school principal enters the classroom and tells the students that a police inspector, Giovanna, wants to speak to them. Giovanna then greets the students and asks if they know the whereabouts of a classmate named Martino. Ivan and Brando make another joke, but Giovanna ignores them and mentions that if anyone sees or hears from Martino, they need to contact the police immediately.
Ditegli di tornare a casa.
After she's done talking, one of her officers gives her something, and she suddenly stares at Michel, who looks worried. Just then, Giovanna walks up to his table and tells him that he forgot his lunch. Michel looks ashamed, but he collects his food and thanks her while calling her his mom. After she walks away, Ivan and Brando make fun of Michel for having his mom bring his lunch to him at school. Michel doesn't respond to them, but he notices that he's now bleeding through his nose. Michel immediately leaves the classroom to clean his nose and wash his hands in the restroom. As he's about to leave, he hears the school bell ringing and quickly hides inside one of the toilets while looking scared. After a while, Ivan and Brando find him and break a part of the door before dragging him out. They then ask for his money, and even though Michel claims he has none, they eventually check his shoe and find the costume money. Michel is not happy about this, but he can't complain because he's scared of the bullies, who give him a head start to run away before Ivan starts shooting him with a paintball gun.
Sempre meglio che avercelo in galera. Scemo.
As Michel runs away, he initially avoids getting caught by Ivan, but he is quite unlucky and he gets shot eventually. He falls down in the middle of some kids at the school, and the bullies make fun of him as they walk past him. Much later, Michel heads home, and his sister, Candela, looks excited to see him. Michel doesn't want to be bothered, and he heads to the kitchen to greet the cook.
Chi le ha fatte?
She then informs him that there's food for him, but as he learns that his mom cooked it, he says he's not interested. As Michel gets to his room, he turns on his computer and starts stalking Stella's social media page while also contemplating whether to send her a friend request or not. Meanwhile, Candela keeps disturbing Michel and asking how it's possible that Superman's identity remains unknown, even though he only wears a pair of glasses as his disguise. Michel doesn't seem bothered by this, and after he sends a friend request to Stella, he checks his small box to see if he has any money left. Unfortunately,
Candela, per favore.
there's only a small note there, but Michel still looks desperate to buy a costume so he can attend Stella's Halloween party later that day. He eventually leaves the house and heads to a local shop to buy a cheap costume. As he gets there, he's shown an old Chinese superhero costume, and even though he doesn't like it, the shop owner convinces him that it's really nice. Michel then asks what the superhero's powers are,
Che potere avrebbe?
but the shop owner says he'll find out by himself. Elsewhere, Giovanna receives a video of Martino telling his parents that he only went away because he's fed up with being at home. Giovanna doesn't understand why he would do that, and she also feels it's strange because he's a really intelligent boy. Later that night, she arrives home and sees Michel looking dejected while wearing his Halloween costume. Giovanna asks why he hasn't gone to Stella's party, and he says he doesn't like his costume because he doesn't even know who the superhero is.
Non ci vado. Faccio schifo.
Giovanna doesn't think it's so bad, and she says the superhero might be a really good person who fights crime well. Michel asks if it's like his dad, and Giovanna says he also fought bad guys. However, she adds that he was just a cop like her before his death. As Michel still thinks about whether to go to the party, Giovanna encourages him.
Dai, vai alla festa che sennò Stella ci rimane male.
And he eventually leaves. Shortly after, he arrives at the party and Stella looks happy to see him. As she talks about her costume, Brando sees Michelle and asks what he's wearing. He says it's a Chinese superhero costume, and Stella says it's nice. She also mentions that she has been to China before. Michelle then asks how long she'll be staying in town, and she says she hopes to stay for a long time because she likes the fact that it's close to the sea. Michelle likes this.
E qui quanto resti?
But as they keep talking, they suddenly see some of the guests gathering around the TV. As they go closer, Stella sees a recording of herself playing on the TV. Brando then mentions that he got the videos from Michelle's phone after it was seized by the teacher earlier that day. As Stella looks at him, Michelle looks embarrassed and runs away to the bathroom. He then laments about how things are turning out for him. As he also complains about his costume and says he doesn't know what it can do, he makes a wish to be invisible, and lightning suddenly strikes in the area.
Fammi sparire e fammi diventare invisibile!
Michelle eventually jumps out of the window and heads home looking disappointed. The next morning, Michelle wakes up and sees his dog looking at him weirdly. He ignores it and heads to the bathroom to take his bath. While brushing his teeth and looking at the mirror, he suddenly notices that he's now invisible. Michelle looks shocked and doesn't know what to do. As his mom enters the room, she doesn't see anyone there, and she wonders where Michelle is. She eventually looks around and only sees the dog, but Michelle quickly writes a note saying he has already left for school.
E adesso?
After Giovanna leaves the house, Michelle wraps himself up with some clothes and heads to school. However, as he's about to head inside, he rethinks his decision and calls himself a monster because he thinks it's weird that he's invisible. Before he heads back home, he sees Yvonne packing his paintball gun inside his bag, and this gives Michelle an idea.
Sono un mostro.
He then enters the classroom and takes out the paintball gun from Yvonne's bag. After he shoots it on the board near the teacher, Michelle drops the paintball gun on Ivan. Everyone thinks he did it, and the teacher scolds him. Meanwhile, Michelle sneaks into the teacher's office and finds his test sheet to write the correct answers so he can get a good grade. He then goes to disturb Brando while he's playing tennis. Unfortunately, Brando loses his match, and his dad scolds him for it. As he's then in the locker room, Michelle pranks him by getting him really scared after he moves a tennis ball. After Michelle eventually leaves the school looking fulfilled, he sees some girls heading into the building. Michelle realizes that they're going into the changing room, so he follows them. When he enters, someone tries to throw a towel on the bench, but it lands on him. As the girls see that there's someone under the towel, they look really shocked. Unfortunately, Michelle's powers start wearing off, and he turns visible again. He looks embarrassed by this, and as the girls take off the towel, they see him and scream loudly. Michelle gets reported to the principal, and Giovanna comes over to take him home. While in the car, Giovanna says she doesn't understand why he went into the girls' changing room.
Alle ragazze piace andare per gradi.
She also mentions that he nearly got expelled, but Michelle doesn't say anything. The next day at school, a psychologist working with the police named Basili comes to the school to announce that Brando is now missing. As he advises the students to always communicate their emotions instead of running away, everyone keeps looking at Michelle and making fun of him for what happened the previous day. Suddenly, Michelle notices that he's starting to turn invisible again, so he covers his arms and waits for the school bell to ring before running out of the class. As he gets home, he meets Candela in his room.
Non è vero.
And he quickly turns to face the wall while telling her to leave. Candela doesn't get why he's sending her out of his room, but she pretends to leave by opening the door and closing it again. As he then takes off his clothes, Candela sees that he's invisible, and she screams loudly. Michelle quickly covers her mouth and tells her not to scream.
Ti prego, non dire niente, ti spiego tutto.
Candela agrees not to do this, and Michelle then explains how he likely got his powers from the superhero costume. Candela thinks it looks like magical pajamas that can make people invisible for a long time. Michelle still seems bothered by his new powers.
Un pigiama magico?
But Candela says he's now a superhero and that he can save people from danger. Michelle says there's no one to save, but Candela mentions that he should call himself the Invisible Boy. The next day, Basili tells Giovanna and the other cops at the police department that he doesn't think there's anything suspicious about the disappearances of Brando and Martino. He adds that the kids likely just left home because they were overwhelmed by the pressure they were facing at home. Giovanna still thinks there might be something more to it, but Basili mentions that from the messages sent by the boys to their families, it's quite clear that they've not been kidnapped.
Va bene, allora perché lei è stato mandato qui?
Much later, Giovanna arrives home while Michelle is reading a comic book about superheroes. As she's about to enter his room, he quickly takes off his clothes and Giovanna thinks he's not around. When she gets to her room, she calls someone and laments about how Michelle has been behaving. She also says she thinks he might have found out that he's adopted. Michelle is shocked by this, but he doesn't say anything. He then heads out to the beach and plays with the swing while thinking about what Giovanna said. Coincidentally, Stella also shows up at the beach and sees the swing moving without anyone sitting on it. As she realizes that there's likely someone there, Stella walks closer and asks who it is and if they're a ghost or an angel.